A young girl sat by the checkout in the shopping center, just watching people buy food, and the Billionaire CEO said the shopping center was alive with the hum of people rushing in and out, carts filled with groceries rattling against tiled floors, voices overlapping in a mix of chatter, laughter, and hurried conversations, the scent of freshly baked bread drifting from the bakery nearby. But in the middle of all this liveliness sat a small girl named Lily, just 9 years old, pressed quietly against the side of the checkout counter, almost blending into the background where no one paid much attention, her small figure dwarfed by the towering racks of candy bars and magazines, her thin arms wrapped tightly around her knees as if holding herself together. Her hair was tangled, strands falling messily over her pale face, her little dress torn at the edges and faded from too many days in the sun, and her shoes, once pink, were now scuffed and frayed, the soles nearly peeling away. She wasn't loud, she didn't beg for attention, and she certainly didn't cry out for help. Instead, her large brown eyes simply followed the movements of people buying food, each glance filled with both longing and restraint, as though she wanted to reach out, but kept herself rooted in silence. She watched every loaf of bread that slid across the conveyor belt, every packet of rice as it was bagged, every apple that rolled forward, bright and fresh, into the waiting hands of shoppers, her eyes lingering a little longer each time someone bought something warm, like roasted chicken or fresh pastries, the steam rising from the bags only making her own hunger twist painfully in her stomach. She tucked her broken doll closer to her chest, the fabric worn thin, a tiny comfort in the chaos around her, and leaned slightly to the side as carts squeaked by, almost invisible to the rushing adults who didn't even notice a child sitting at their feet. For most of them, she was just part of the background, like a forgotten shadow against the bright advertisements plastered on the walls, invisible in a world where everyone seemed too busy to look down. But for Lily, every detail mattered, every sound and smell painted a sharper picture of what she didn't have. She could hear coins clinking on the counter as customers paid. She could smell the citrus from oranges piled high at the register. She could see candy bars lined up in rows just inches away, yet entirely unreachable. She shifted uncomfortably, her stomach growling softly, but she pressed her lips together, determined not to make a sound, determined to simply watch quietly, as if watching could fill her hunger. Her small frame trembled slightly when a child her age passed by holding a large bag of popcorn, the buttery scent filling the air, and Lily's fingers tightened around the doll, not in jealousy, but in silent yearning, the kind of longing that comes from days of emptiness. The laughter of families echoed around her, parents talking cheerfully to their children about dinners they would cook, promises of ice cream and treats exchanged casually, words that to Lily felt like a dream spoken in another world, one she could only observe but never enter. The cashiers barely glanced her way, their focus on scanning items quickly, moving lines forward, their expressions tired from long hours. Yet even their brief glances slid past her like she wasn't really there. And so Lily remained a quiet observer, her eyes telling the story her lips never dared to share, her body hunched but her gaze sharp, following food as if each piece carried hope, as if each purchase was a fleeting chance to imagine being fed. Her small heart beat faster whenever someone dropped a piece of fruit or when a bag accidentally tore, but inevitably it was scooped up by hurried hands, leaving her empty-handed again. Still, she didn't cry. There were no tears left in her, only a steady quietness that seemed older than her years, a silence that spoke louder than words. People brushed past her, carts squealing, bags swinging, voices calling out for children to keep up. But Lily sat perfectly still, her whole world focused on the rhythm of groceries sliding down the counter, the steady beeps of the scanner, the rustling of paper bags filling with meals she could only dream of. Though the world carried on, full of noise and movement, Lily's small existence at that checkout counter was one of invisible patience, one of waiting, of watching, of hungering, not just for food, but for someone, anyone to notice. The world inside the shopping center moved like a restless tide, people flowing in and out with arms full of purchases, the rhythm of scanning and bagging never stopping. Yet among all those faces and hurried steps, One pair of eyes finally noticed the small figure pressed against the side of the counter, and they belonged to Alexander Reid, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in business circles, a man draped in authority, in wealth, in the cold armor of success, the kind of man who seemed untouchable, living far above the concerns of ordinary life. Alexander was 42, the kind of CEO who commanded boardrooms with sharp words and sharper instincts, the kind of man who walked with purpose, his presence enough to make assistants scramble and executives hesitate before speaking. His days a string of contracts, numbers, and decisions worth millions. His nights often spent alone in penthouses filled with glass and silence. His life was polished like his tailored suits, sleek like his black luxury car parked outside. Every detail a picture of achievement, yet inside, a hollowness he never dared admit, even to himself, often pressed against him in the quiet hours. That day, and he stood at the checkout placing his neatly arranged groceries, organic vegetables, fine bread, a bottle of expensive wine. He was not expecting anything more than a swift transaction before disappearing back into his world. But then, as his hand brushed the edge of the counter, his gaze shifted and his eyes collided with Lily's. For a moment, time seemed to still. The constant beep of the scanner fading, the chatter of shoppers dissolving into the background, leaving only the silent conversation between a man used to owning everything and a child who had nothing. Alexander saw hunger there, yes, but it was more than hunger. It was a quiet longing, a searching innocence, a plea that was not spoken but radiated from those wide, fragile eyes, the kind of gaze that did not beg for money, but begged for something deeper, something human, something kind. He had met countless eyes in his lifetime, eyes of rivals, eyes of investors, eyes of admirers, eyes that concealed motives and greed, but never had he met eyes so unguarded, so raw in their truth, eyes that seemed to pierce through the expensive layers of his life and reach something buried, something he had thought long gone. His breath caught faintly in his chest, an unusual break in his carefully measured composure, and he felt a strange, almost forgotten stir within him, as though a locked door deep inside had creaked open, letting in a fragile light. He could not name the feeling immediately, for it was alien to the man he had become. But there was a softness tugging at him, a warmth he did not expect, and it made his heart beat uneven, his focus faltering in a way that no business deal, no corporate crisis had ever done. He shifted slightly, his expensive watch glinting under the lights, yet his eyes did not leave hers, and in that stillness he realized just how rarely he had truly looked at someone without expectation, and without calculation, without the mask of power. Lily's gaze was a mirror he had not asked for, showing him not his wealth, not his strength, but the emptiness that came with never being truly seen, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt exposed, vulnerable in front of a child who did not even know his name. The cashier cleared their throat impatiently, pulling his attention back for a second as the groceries slid down the belt, but even as he reached for his wallet, his mind lingered on that small figure against the counter, those trembling hands holding a broken doll, those eyes refusing to look away from the food, yet holding on to dignity with quiet strength. Something inside him, something he thought had long since withered beneath the weight of ambition and loneliness, began to stir with life again, like embers flickering after years of darkness. He knew nothing about her yet, not her name, not her story, but he knew that those eyes had reached into a place of his heart he had buried under layers of steel, and the sudden ache in his chest told him this moment was not something he could walk away from as easily as he had walked away from countless meetings, handshakes, and partnerships. It was as though the noise of the world had dimmed, leaving only that fragile connection, an unspoken thread pulling at him, urging him not to turn his gaze, not to ignore what others had overlooked. And so Alexander stood there, his groceries waiting, his polished exterior still intact, but inside, something had shifted, a seed of change planted by the simple, wordless glance of a hungry little girl whose innocence had spoken louder than any words could. Alexander's hand hovered over his grocery bags for a moment, but his thoughts were no longer with the polished items waiting to be scanned. Instead, they were anchored to the fragile figure by the counter, and before he even realized what he was doing, his footsteps began to move away from the checkout, each step deliberate, measured, yet strangely hesitant, as of the man who had once marched confidently into empires of glass and steel, was suddenly uncertain in front of a child's quiet presence. The noise of the shopping center continued. Voices, laughter, the constant beeping of scanners. But for Alexander, it all seemed muffled, like background echoes to something far more important unfolding before him. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her, lowering himself from the commanding height he usually held, until finally he was at her level, his tailored suit bending at the knees, his polished shoes grounded against the tiled floor, his sharp presence softened by an unusual gentleness in his face. For a long moment he simply looked at her, truly looked, taking in the way her tiny hands clutched the worn doll as though it were the last piece of comfort she owned, the way her thin shoulders hunched inward as if bracing against an invisible weight, the way her eyes shimmered with both defiance and desperation. Then, in a voice that carried none of the authority his employees feared, none of the sharpness that echoed in boardrooms, he asked softly, "Why are you sitting here all alone?" The question hung in the air, simple yet heavy, as if it had been waiting to be spoken for a very long time. Lily's body tensed at the sound of his words, her fingers tightening around the doll's fraying fabric, her eyes flickering with uncertainty, suspicion, and something close to fear, for she was not used to being addressed with such direct attention, not used to anyone bending down to her level and seeing her as more than a shadow. For a moment she said nothing, her lips parting and closing again as though the words themselves struggled to find courage, her small chest rising and falling quickly with the weight of being noticed. Alexander did not push. He stayed still, his tall frame crouched low, his gaze steady yet gentle, a quiet patience, radiating from him that felt foreign even to himself. Finally, Lily's trembling lips parted, her voice no louder than a whisper, fragile but clear enough to cut through the hum of the crowd around them. I'd just like to see food," she said, her tone a mixture of embarrassment and longing, her eyes darting quickly toward the grocery bags moving past on the conveyor belt before dropping back down again. "It makes me feel less hungry." The simplicity of her confession struck Alexander like a blow to the chest, not for its words, but for the unguarded truth woven inside them, a truth so raw it left no room for misunderstanding. He had sat in rooms filled with polished men and women, had listened to negotiations layered with strategies, half-truths, and hidden motives, had heard people spin stories of need and desire for the sake of profit, but never, not once in all his 42 years, had he heard something so unpolished, so innocent, so painfully pure. He froze. His breath caught somewhere in his throat, his mind unexpectedly blank, his heart thudding in a way he was unaccustomed to, as though this single sentence from a child had undone years of hardened layers around him. Her eyes did not plead, her words did not ask. She offered nothing but truth. And in that truth, Alexander felt the quiet weight of reality pressed down on him in a way no corporate burden ever had. He studied her face again, the thin cheeks, the slightly chapped lips, the fragile strength in her gaze. And he realized that what she had given him was not just an answer, but a window into her world, a world of emptiness disguised by small acts of hope. A world where even looking at food could bring momentary relief to an aching stomach. For a long heartbeat, he remained still, every instinct in him wanting to respond, yet words failed, leaving only silence stretched between them, silence that felt heavier than any argument he had ever won, silence that told him he was standing at the edge of something he did not yet understand. The sigh, lengths between them lingered, heavy yet fragile, but Alexander did not let it stretch into abandonment. Instead, acting on an impulse that felt strangely natural, he extended his hand toward Lily, his palm open and steady, and after a moment of hesitation, her small fingers, hesitant and trembling, slipped into his, The contrast between his strong, well-groomed hand and her tiny, fragile one so stark it sent a ripple through his chest, and without speaking further, he guided her gently away from the crowded checkout, weaving past shoppers and carts, until they reached the warm glow of the bakery tucked within the shopping center, its air filled with the scent of fresh bread, pastries, and simmering soups. The golden light spilling from the glass displays reflected in her wide eyes as Alexander gestured toward the counter, ordering bread that crackled at the crust, a bowl of steaming soup rich with vegetables, and, almost as an afterthought but with a tenderness he could not explain, a slice of soft cake topped with a simple layer of cream. The cashier glanced briefly at Lily but said nothing, handing over the tray, and Alexander carried it to a small table by the window where the noise of the center faded slightly, replaced by the gentle clink of cutlery and the warmth of ovens working in the back. He set the tray down carefully, and Lily, still clutching her doll in one hand, looked at the food with a mixture of disbelief and awe, her lips parting slightly as if she were afraid it might disappear if she blinked. Alexander gave a small nod, encouraging her, and slowly, almost reverently, she reached for the bread first, tearing a piece and bringing it to her lips, chewing with a care that showed just how long it had been since she'd eaten something warm and filling. The soup followed, her hands wrapping around the bowl as though its heat alone could soothe her bones, and indeed as she took spoonful after spoonful, her shoulders eased, the tension melting away under the comfort of nourishment. But it was when she lifted the fork to the slice of cake, her voice trembled when she whispered between bites, "I haven't eaten cake since my mom left." And the words hung between them like shattered glass, delicate and cutting all at once, her small frame curling inward as if the confession had cost her strength. Alexander's chest tightened with an ache so unfamiliar it almost frightened him, an ache that had nothing to do with business or power, but everything to do with the raw humanity sitting before him, and in that moment his heart cracked open in a way he hadn't thought possible. He had dined in the most extravagant restaurants, tasted meals crafted by world-class chefs, sipped wines that cost more than most families earned in a year, yet none of it had ever stirred him the way this simple sight did. Watching a hungry child eat bread, soup, and cake with tears staining her cheeks. It was not pity that swelled within him, but something deeper, something tender, something close to empathy, real and unfiltered, the kind that could not be bought or orchestrated, the kind that came only when walls fell and humanity reached across divides. He sat there silently, his usually restless mind unusually still, simply watching her, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, as though he feared even words might break the fragile sanctity of what was happening before him. When the last crumbs of cake had disappeared from the plate, and the steam from the soup had long since faded into the air, a hush settled over their small corner of the bakery, a kind of silence that wasn't empty but waiting, and Alexander, still seated across from Lily, finally found his voice again, gentle and careful, as though afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile trust that had begun to form between them. He leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table, his gaze steady but softened in a way that few people had ever seen, and he asked her about her life, not as a man interrogating, but as someone genuinely wanting to understand. At first, Lily hesitated, her eyes dropping to the doll in her lap, her small fingers fidgeting with its frayed edges as if drawing courage from the familiar comfort. But then, slowly, the words began to flow, halting at first and then steadier, painting a picture that made Alexander's chest ache with every detail. She spoke of nights spent in a small shelter where beds were lined close together and meals were uncertain, of mornings when she wandered the streets searching for scraps or quiet corners to rest, of the emptiness left behind when her mother had vanished from her world and never returned, leaving her with no family, no arms to hold her, no voice to call her name with warmth. She told him how sometimes she would linger outside shops just to smell the food she couldn't taste, how she sat at the checkout not because she hoped someone would hand her something, but because simply watching others buy bread and fruit made her stomach feel a little less hollow, her heart a little less lonely. Each word was simple, but together they wove a story that struck Alexander deeper than any tragedy he had read in newspapers or heard in passing conversations, because this was no distant statistic, no faceless number. This was a living, breathing child sitting across from him, her voice carrying the quiet resilience of survival and the unspoken ache of abandonment. He listened without interrupting, his usual habit of cutting into conversations forgotten, his face unreadable to others but inwardly shaken. Every sentence Lily spoke, tugging harder at something inside him that had been dormant too long. When her words finally trailed off, fading into the hum of the bakery around them, a heaviness lingered in the air, but Alexander did not allow despair to set towel between them. Instead, he moved with deliberate gentleness, lifting one hand from the table and resting it lightly on her small shoulder, the warmth of his touch steady, anchoring. His voice, when it came, was low but unwavering, and each word seemed to echo with a conviction he hadn't realized until he spoke it aloud. "You will never sit hungry at a checkout again," he said. His eyes locked on hers so she could see the truth in them, so she would know these were not empty words but a vow. "From today, you're not alone anymore." For Lily, the sentence hung in the air like a miracle, too vast to comprehend all at once, her young heart struggling to accept that someone, anyone, would care enough to speak such a promise to her. And yet the sincerity in his eyes, the steady weight of his hand, made her believe in a way she had long forgotten how to. For Alexander, as the words left his mouth, it felt like more than a promise. It felt like destiny, as though the life he had lived until now, with all its wealth and success, had been leading him quietly to this moment, to this child, to this vow that reshaped the meaning of everything he thought he knew about purpose. The promise Alexander made that night did not fade with the closing of the bakery's doors. It became the seed of action that grew with each passing day, and in the weeks that followed, he moved with a determination that surprised even himself, his once cold world reshaped by the presence of a little girl who had silently captured his heart, until finally the papers were signed, the legalities settled, and Lily, who had once sat unnoticed at a checkout counter, was no longer a shadow of the streets, but the daughter of a man who had everything yet realized he had owned nothing of real value until now. The mansion that had stood tall and proud against the skyline, a fortress of glass and marble that once rang with emptiness, began to change almost overnight as Lily's presence seeped into its walls. The silence that had lingered in vast halls was broken by the echo of small footsteps racing across polished marble floors, footsteps that seemed to breathe life into rooms that had long stood still. Where once the walls displayed only carefully curated art, they now blossomed with drawings Lily made in bursts of creativity, colorful scribbles taped to corners, stick figures smiling beside houses, and sometimes little sketches of herself and Alexander holding hands beneath a sun. And though they were simple, to Alexander they were more priceless than any painting his wealth had ever bought. The staff, once accustomed to moving quietly in the background, found themselves smiling more often as Lily's laughter danced through the air like music, softening even the sternest hearts. And Alexander, who had lived in rigid routines, discovered himself adjusting his schedule not for clients or shareholders, but to sit with her at breakfast, to listen to her stories, to watch her fall asleep with her dolls safely tucked beside her. At night, when the vast dining room had been reduced to a table for two, her small voice often rose in prayer, words so innocent and sincere they wrapped around Alexander like warmth he hadn't known he needed, each prayer softening edges in him he had believed permanent. The transformation was quiet yet profound, a shift not just in the mansion but in the man himself, and with each passing day, Alexander began to realize that the life he had built, the empire he had fought to maintain, all paled in comparison to the simple joy of hearing a child call his name with trust in her voice. One evening, after a day filled with her laughter echoing through the garden, as she chased butterflies and her delighted shrieks when she managed to climb too high on the swing before tumbling safely into his arms. They sat together in her new room, a space that glowed with gentle light and toys carefully chosen, her drawings scattered across the floor. Lily crawled into his lap, wrapping her thin arms around him with a strength that felt larger than her small frame, and nestled her head against his chest with the ease of someone who finally knew she was safe. In that quiet moment, she lifted her face just enough to whisper words so soft yet so piercing they branded themselves on his heart forever. "Thank you for choosing me." The simplicity of the sentence carried the weight of her whole life, of nights alone, of hunger endured, of longing unanswered, and Alexander, hearing it, felt his throat tighten, his carefully controlled composure cracking as tears welled in his eyes, unashamed, unrestrained, flowing freely in a way they had not in years. He held her tighter, understanding then with a clarity beyond words that though he had offered her shelter, food and a name, it was she who had given him something infinitely greater. She had filled the emptiness he hadn't even known how to name, had softened a heart he thought long beyond repair, had reminded him what it meant to love without condition. In that embrace, he realized he had not saved her. She had saved him. And in her small presence, his vast world finally felt whole.